Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 175th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today's topic is as politically charged as any topic we can discuss. Some think that only right-wing extremists can properly be labeled as terrorists, while others claim that left-wing extremist attacks far outpace those on the right. Let's see what the panel thinks. Today's panel beginning with Patty Haskins, member of the Wadsworth City Council, Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services, and Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist, and Joe Gaines, former member of the faculty of the University of Akron. Patty, do you think the terms terrorist and terrorism are overly politicized?
I think by the nature of the definition, they are political in nature. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influence, such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. So right in the definition is the fact that when an organization or person is spurred on by a political doctrine to perform violent acts, then that by nature will be labeled as domestic terrorism. One of the interesting things I found out about domestic terrorism, however, is that it's not necessarily it is not labeled as a crime in and of itself. For example, you cannot take someone who's arrested at an incident and take them into court and charge them with domestic terrorism. Statute doesn't exist. They can be charged with murder or with assault or with theft or other means, but they will not be charged with terrorism, as that is not the case, of course, if the terrorism is committed by a non-citizen or a non-resident of the United States. So to me, that is of interest. There have been moves to actually make domestic terrorism a crime, but those have been blocked, and it's really kind of a bipartisan block. There's people on both sides of the fence that think that it should, and there's people on both sides of the aisle that feel that it shouldn't. I found that AOC, for example, is opposed to making domestic terrorism a specific crime, and they basically feel that there are enough laws on the books already that can handle all of the crimes that would be committed. As far as it being political or right or left, I mean, there have been, back into the 1800s, there were domestic terrorist groups. They may not have been classified as such, but they did exist. I mean, we can go back to the Ku Klux Klan and their organization. One of the things I found interesting was that in determining or looking at right-wing extremism, that for the past 25 years, the majority of attacks and plots were done by right-wing extremists. In 2019, 66% of attacks were by right-wing extremists, and 90%, which was surprising to me, of the attacks in 2020 were from right-wing extremists. And that the number one actual organization or type of terrorism that exists by far is this right-wing, and I should say white supremacist groups and their thinkings. I mean, there are other types of terrorism though, like anti-abortion, eco-terrorism, and animal rights, racial lynching. But again, the number one is white wing, and that's why I think people think that that the right wing extremism or terrorism exists more. Now, that does not make it any worse than any type of terrorism, because it does exist on both sides. I mean, we've gone through times in the past with groups like the Weathermen, or if you remember back to Patty Hearst, the Symbionese Liberation Army. These were left-wing terrorist groups and domestic terrorist groups, and were treated as such. It's just that it seems the one that has promulgated the most hate throughout the country right now are the white supremacists, which are considered a right-wing extremist organization. Doesn't mean the left-wing extremist doesn't exist. It's just not as prevalent as the other.
One question before we move on to Bryan. What would you say is the biggest right-wing terrorist event? Patty.
Oh, before you go to Bryan, I don't know that I would name one in of itself.
Can you name any?
Oh yeah, a right-wing terrorist event, a white supremacist. We had the shootings or the murder in Charlotte, the shootings of the in the church in what was it, South Carolina? That church where the shootings occurred.
What about? Well, I'm sorry, Bryan. Why don't you hop in? I can see you've got a grin on your face.
Well, I would agree that any sort of terrorism is terrorism, whether it's right or left. I'm a little hard pressed to label different events as a terrorist event, because it's very hard to determine the motive of these individuals. Now, if we're just going to say a group of white people got together, or some individual that's a little screwy decides to shoot up some people, that's terrorism, and because he's white, that's white supremacy. I'm not sure I'm prepared to label that terrorism. It's terrible. We have laws on the books, and those people should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What's a little disturbing to me is that some of the things that are happening and continue to happen in Portland, they're still trying to burn down that courthouse. Antifa is still out there on a nightly basis, but we're not hearing about that because, obviously it doesn't make the news anymore. I'm not going to say it's suppressed, but it's not hitting the national news because it's not politically expedient to highlight these particular incidences. So I would put groups like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, some of their things that they've done, that's terrorism, and it's domestic terrorism because it's all homegrown. This latest incident that's happened in Boulder, you'll notice that it started out very strongly. If you followed it at all, it was a white man went in and killed 10 people plus 10 people and a police officer. And as soon as they found out the gentleman's name and that he was an immigrant, I believe from Somalia, and he's been here about 10 years, and they went to his Facebook page and they did all this stuff, and they started seeing that this guy is kind of nuts. He's kind of crazy. That whole narrative has now sort of been memory hold when it comes to that particular event. So I'm a little cautious about labeling terrorism. Now, I'll tell you what is
unless it's Black Lives Matter or Antifa.
No.
You can't have it both ways, Brian.
I think if
those were terrorists, and
if QAnon is out there, if they're out there burning down buildings, and if they're out there, going down the street screaming at people and keeping, threatening people on the street, then they're terrorists. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The two young men that made the pressure cooker bombs in Boston, those I believe that those are terrorists. Okay. Yes. They actively went out. They found stuff on the internet. They planted those things to do maximum damage. That to me, that's terrorism. That's domestic terrorism. When when a group of people get together and they decide that they're going to plant bombs, or they're going to go after a particular group of people in a synagogue or something of that nature, to me, that's domestic terrorism. I mean, so it's a little harder for me to say everything that happens is domestic terror. Do the people in Chicago live under a threat of domestic terror? They certainly do. I think it was 22 people were killed or wounded over the weekend in Chicago. That is domestic terror, from how I would view it. Those people are fear for their life on a daily basis. So, I'm a little hesitant to just label everything domestic terror, whether you're white, black, whatever. This recent thing that seems to be bubbling up to the top, which has been going on for some time, are these attacks on the Asian community. And it got legs because the one guy was white. But the predominant attacks against the Asian community in San Francisco and New York, where they are blacks, cold cocking the little old lady crossing the road. There are plenty of videos out there that you can pull up on YouTube of the little Chinese guy walking across the street, minding his own business, and two guys come up from behind him and just lay him out. To me, that, what's that about? How do we label that? Is that a hate crime? I would think so.
Yes,
I would think
agree.
that's a hate crime.
What do we do about it?
What's that? What do we do about it? We find those two people and we prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. That's what we do.
But what can we do to prevent it from happening again?
Well, what we do is we begin to explain and help people understand that no matter what your ethnicity is, you're not the enemy.
Right.
And that you can't just start focusing your hate on a group. It was the Koreans, if you remember back when the Koreans went into New York City and in some neighborhoods that were predominantly black, that were just gutted out. They started a business. They all worked the business. Next thing you know, it's a successful fruit stand, a store, and then they go and they get burned out. I mean, what's that about?
Does gun control have any part in this?
I think there's enough laws on the books as far as guns are concerned that if we just start enforcing those, that we wouldn't have an issue. We need to get the crazies away from guns.
Ron, what is your current thinking?
You asked, your original question was, is this overly politicized? And maybe it is. I think Bryan might agree with that. But yeah, it's political because looking at everything from all of the racial and other things, the insurrection on January 6th, these are political actions because individuals are in some way responding to what they see as a political stance someplace in the country, and in their state, their community. And so it's going to be, in that sense, a political movement. Now, can you define it as terrorism? Some of these definitions, particularly the one on the Patriot Act that you sent me, is pretty broad, and just talks about individuals doing any kind of action. Certainly, I think it's pretty clear on the January 6th that several of the white supremacist groups are certainly guilty of that. The Proud Boys and the Three Percenters. Just getting a paper today, there's an article about collision between three of these groups. So some things I think, Bryan, sometimes it's pretty easy to tell. And whether you find it difficult to define that or not, well, okay. But I think sometimes it's a little easier than others. And as you say, the Boston group with the pressure cooker bombs, this is a domestic terrorism action. There's so much that's involved here, racially oriented, instigated, back to the Ku Klux Klan, to the Japanese internments in World War II, for instance. That was certainly political in a nature, and it was, that's a little off the topic for terrorism, but I have a good friend who's Korean American, and I commented and I asked him how he was doing in this particular thing. He says, well, he could remember as a kid with that prejudice and that going on. back where he lived in a little town in central Pennsylvania. And he said in his particular suburb in Detroit doesn't have a lot of Asian businesses, so he feels pretty safe at the moment. But it's out there, and it's such a complex issue here that I'm a little befuddled by it, frankly, as to why we would call one thing terrorism and one thing not. Some of it's pretty clear, some of it's much less so, and I think you got to look at each individual cases here.
Well, one of the elements in both definitions by the Patriot Act and the FBI is that the act has to be intended to affect public policy. There are a lot of things that we're calling terrorist acts that don't appear to be trying to affect public policy.
Yeah.
Well, I think about things that I thought were horrible. Ferguson, for instance, that riot damaged a lot of property, a lot of criminal acts took place and all. But was it terrorism? Was it trying to really affect public policy or to just let off steam?
There's a really strange movie that I've thought about for years and years. It was a Spike Lee movie back in the times of the tremendous racial unrest in the 70s. It's called Do the Right Thing. And this is about a white privilege kind of action here, where a white fella had a pizza shop in a black neighborhood, and a riot comes up, and is what he thought was a good friend, portrayed by Spike Lee, throws a garbage can through his window, because. And it seems to me now that's a protest here. Again, we're getting off of the terrorism thing, but it's going on. There's a riot going on, and the black guy figures that this white guy, although as well-meaning as he was and as beneficial as the community, he didn't belong there. and it's been a very troubling thought to me. And terrorists, the domestic terrorists, particularly where it's racially oriented, the Black Lives Matter movement, some of those others, where individuals there take violent action against what they perceive as a society's ills. The government says suppressing it in some ways. It's in some ways understandable to me. In other ways, I'm terrified by it.
Commit a lot of crimes of opportunity.
If you
What's
just
your thinking,
labeling
Joe?
it though as terrorism, as I said, it's not a crime. So I think we get caught up in this definition of terrorism, and whether it is terrorism or not, if it's still a crime, then it is treated as a crime and punished as a crime. And just because it isn't called terrorism, I don't think it makes it any less of a problem. Now, if you're referring to hate crimes, there are special laws and treatment and punishments that are given to those that are convicted of hate crimes. But just because you call it terrorism doesn't make it any worse or any better.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should get locked up in which group is called terrorist and which isn't.
The reason I asked the question, is it overly politicized, is that it's so easy to come up with your own definition of terrorism. You can, if you look up domestic terrorism on Wikipedia, you'll find out they only list right-wing groups as terrorist groups, not a mention. But if you look at another article, it says that left-wing groups were responsible for far more terrorist acts than right-wing. But they're taking a lot of liberty with the definition. Joe, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right. I think they are taking a lot of liberty. I think the FBI and the CIA have investigated both and come up with, basically saying that there is no, you can't put it on one as a terrorist group. Especially, I think they say that you can't put it on the liberal or the leftist. I don't know. I have no problem with protesting. I think protesting is the American way. I think is something we need to do at times. But when does it carry too far? Does it carry too far when it becomes violence? And it does.
I think whenever you've got a protest, there are going to be members of the protest that get overly stimulated and start jumping up and down on somebody's car and breaking windows in stores and all of that. I don't know that you can properly blame the group for the behavior of certain individuals within the group.
Would agree.
On Joe's point, he makes a good one. I've heard it said, your right to swing your fist ends at my nose.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I'm all for protesting, whether you're right, left, whatever. But when you start, damaging other people's property, and you start chasing people down the street, and you start burning things down, I think that's where it ends. That's where.
Well, that's also where the definition of terrorism kicks in. You have to be committing a criminal act in order to influence public policy. At least
And
by
then do you
two
define, then is it the group that is the terrorist or is it the individual?
Well, I've told this story before, but I had a couple years ago, there was going to be a protest at the University of Akron. I forget what they were protesting, but there was a major protest. And a lot of my students were anxious to go to the protest. And I said, why? They said, well, it's a protest. I said, but what's the reason? Why are you going? Oh, it'll be fun. They don't look at the negative. They don't look at the violence. They don't look at what could happen. They don't look at, things can get out of hand. And I don't think they see that.
Mhm.
That's why a lot of times what we're talking about is youth involved. Not always, but can be.
I have a quick story to tell. I was down at Akron U on May 4th of 1970. The shootings at Kent State happened earlier in the day, but in the evening.
I was there.
You were there? At Kent?
Yeah.
But at Akron U, there were crossed what's that street on the south side of the university at the time, and into a field, Carroll Street, trying to get them to respond negatively to him, and the students wouldn't do it. They just stood there, and he looked really stupid, and went on his way. But I think it was a case of a lot of people getting stimulated by the shootings at Kent and trying to do something. Yeah. But anyway, that's my own little terrorist story.
Well, when I was at Kent, I was in history class, and a girl ran into the history class yelling and shouting that our brothers and sisters are out there being killed, which really upset the class. The professor, of course, said, look, we've got 10 minutes left in class. If you want to leave right now, you can with no problems. He said, but what good would it do? Why not just stay here and relax? So I stayed and he stayed. And then when he left, I left with him and he got tear gassed.
Fast forward to my daughter at Kent State. And on there was a May 4th celebration of some sort every few years. And the young students that were at Kent at the time really poked a lot of fun at these aging hippies that were holding candles at places where students got shot. And they thought it was just so much nonsense. So I suppose maybe they were
That's
right.
unfortunate though, so I'm sorry.
That they thought it was
profoundly
But they poke
changed my
fun. Yeah.
profoundly changed my whole attitudes toward this. I think it's the major event that turned me personally into a pacifist, I think, and eventually caused me to join the Mennonite Church, which has had a stance of anti-war. it was profoundly affected me, and still to this day does. I was leaning that way anyway during the earlier stages of the Vietnam conflict, but that crystallized it for me.
Well,
How did
I
you
lost
feel
a friend
about
that day.
How did you feel about the student activity the night?
And the person I lost,
Pardon me?
what's that?
I
Go ahead, say it again, please.
No, how did you feel about the students' activities that took place at the ROTC building and downtown businesses and all that on the night of May the 3rd?
Well, it was wrong.
That caused the guard to come out in the first place.
Well, I'll tell you, I was there. I actually went to see what was going on. I could see from my dorm that there was a fire going on. So I went to the ROTC building because I was in ROTC at the time. And I had records and everything else there, and I wanted to, save them. Got close to the building, and they lined us up, and the guard came, and the guard fixed their bayonets, turned towards us, and started going, kill, 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 kill. And that changed I
never heard that.
Completely
story.
changed
Huh.
it didn't change my mind as much as it just scared the hell out of me. I didn't know what was going on. I realized it was bigger than I thought.
Well, it's solidified an awful lot of opinions, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, folks. We're unfortunately out of time. And we'll get together again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
See ya.